Good afternoon, everyone. Today's Torah portion is Ki Tisa, which, if you're in the blue art scroll Chumash, you can find it on page 484. Some of the highlights of this week's Torah portion are obviously the story of the golden calf, and the result of that was Moshe Rabbeinu breaking the tablets, the luchos that he brought down from Har Sinai. So that's like the main event in this week's Torah portion. To Moshe, after forgiveness was granted to the Jewish people, to carve out a second set of tablets, and incidentally, this was granted, but as you know, Yom Kippur, which is observed each set of 10. So it's not just arbitrary that Yom Kippur falls out on that day. It actually marks the anniversary of the day that God forgave the Jewish people for the very grave sin of worshiping a golden calf just 40 days after receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. But before we get to the main story of the Torah portion, which is the golden calf, we have some other commandments in this week's parsha. And the first commandment in the parsha is the census, counting the Jewish people. And as you know, when the Jewish people were counted, they were always counted through contributions. Hashem says, let every Jew give a contribution, and count the contributions, count to half shekels, and you'll know how many Jews there are. And the simple reason is because if you want to know what the value of people are, it's measured not by their just numbers, but by their contributions, by their impact they make. We know there aren't many Jews in the world, only 13 million, 14 million maybe, but our contributions, even though we're less than 0.25%, is enormous. I don't have to tell you about all the Nobel Prizes, 30-something percent, and therefore count the contributions and you'll get the true measure and census of the Jewish people. So it starts with the mitzvah of giving a half shekel and the very beautiful idea that every Jew is a half. We complete one another. The rich shouldn't give more. The poor shouldn't give less in this particular contribution, in this particular collection, symbolizing that one's large gift and one's small gift, as long as it's their capacity, their potential that they're giving according to, then that's a meaningful gift to God. It's not just the number, it's the sacrifice that is made by giving that contribution. And therefore, in a sense, the rich and the poor are two halves of the same whole. Just an interesting thing that if you know, it says tzedakah tatzil mimavet, charity saves from death. If you look at the word machzit in Hebrew, the middle letter is a tzaddik, which stands for tzedakah. To the right and to the left of the tzaddik, you have ches and yud, which spells chai, life, and to the outer side of the tzaddik, you have the mem and the taf, which spells met, the opposite of life, death. Again, symbolizing that charity not only saves the life of the person you're giving it to, but the giver is saved as well through the act of tzedakah. We know when somebody's sick and we make a mishaberach, we pledge one mitzvah that will give tzedakah on behalf of the sick person because it says charity saves from death. So the idea that those who are close to tzedakah acquire life, and those who are distant from tzedakah, you have the opposite letters of life. But there's a greater meaning, and that is that also when you give, that's the real meaning of life. In other words, there's the Dead Sea, and then there's the Keturah. They both get the water from the Jordan River. The Keturah is full of life, and the Dead Sea is dead. Why? Because the Dead Sea and then releases the water to the rest of Israel. So to be a healthy person, just like physically, you have to, have intake and output, inhale, exhale to live. If you only inhaled, you wouldn't live, you would die. So too with material things, and not just money, but all experiences that we receive, we experience, we enjoy, we take pleasure, but we also have to give. And human beings need to give as much as to receive. And a matter of fact, the word v'nasnu in the beginning of the parsha, they shall give, is a word that could be read forward or backwards. The same 5 letters, Vav, Nun, Taf, Nun, Vav, could be read backwards. I think it's called a pendulum. And the idea is that giving is a form of receiving as well. And therefore, the opening of the Parsha talks about tzedakah. And it's interesting that when it talks about giving tzedakah, it says when you raise up the heads of the Jewish people, you should have them each give the half shekel and count the half shekel. And again, the idea is that we are elevated through the process of giving. And interesting, another thought is that if you take the word Rosh, and you go up 1 letter from each of those 3 letters, head, the Resh goes to the next letter, which is Shin, the Aleph goes to the next letter, which is Bet, and the Shin goes to the next letter, which is Taf. So the next letter up from Resh Aleph Shin, which is Rosh, the head, is Shabbat. And the idea that Shabbat elevates the Jewish people. Now, it's interesting that Shabbat is found later in this week's Parsha as well. The Torah once again tells the Jewish people, remember to keep the day of Shabbos when you build the Mishkan, because all of these portions are talking about the construction of the Mishkan. Remember to keep the day of Shabbos because it's a sign, it's an oath between God and the Jewish people for all future generations. And once again, Shabbos is reiterated. And it's interesting that Shabbat is found during creation of the world, which is God's home for us. And Shabbat is found in our home for God, in the Mishkan construction. The only difference is that in the construction of the world, Shabbat comes at the end of the 6 days of creation. In our Torah portion, it comes before the enactment of the construction. In other words, Teruma and Tetzava was the instructions, and now going forward, the last 2 Torah portions, Vayakel Pekude, is the fulfillment of all of those commandments. So why is it that in the God's world, Shabbat comes at the end of this creation? In our world, meaning when we build a home for God, Shabbat comes on the onset of the construction. And the answer is, we all know in life, we all, there's an expression that says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Now, I don't know where that comes from. It's not a Jewish quote, obviously. But I was thinking to myself, if the road to hell is paved with good intentions, then is the road to heaven paved with bad intentions? Now, what does that mean? Why would that be? But I think what perhaps the Torah is telling us, with the Shabbat being in the 6 days of creation, at the end of creation, and in the human construction, in the beginning of the 6 days of creation, is that there's 2 ways to experience Shabbat. From God's perspective, Shabbat came at the end of the 6 days. He worked for 6 days and he rested on the 7th day. However, from a human being's perspective, Adam and Eve were born on Friday. So they began with Shabbat, and then they went into the 6 days of creation. It's very interesting. Just last night, I was talking to my son, Yosef, and he said to me, what's the first day of the week? And it's interesting. For God, the first day of the week was Sunday, then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Shabbat was the last day of the week. But for Adam and Eve, Shabbat was the first day of their week of creation. They experienced Shabbat before the 6 days of the week. So why this reverse order? And there's actually a discussion in the Talmud. What happens if a person gets lost in the desert and they lose track of time? They don't know which day of the week is Shabbat. It doesn't have to be a desert. It could be a Jew in captivity or some other circumstance. So there's 2 opinions. One says when you realize you lost track, you count 6 days and keep the 7th day, whichever day that is. Others say, no, you keep Shabbat and then you count 6 days. And it's, again, these 2 opinions. Is Shabbat the last day or the first day? And when we talk about intentions, in life is very funny. Sometimes you start out with good intentions, but it doesn't work out the way you intended it. And sometimes it could be the opposite way, like Joseph tells the brothers, you had bad intentions to sell me into slavery and to harm me and to do away with me, but God had good intentions, and it came out to be that I became viceroy of Egypt. So God's intentions always materialize exactly as God planned them. In other words, there's no disconnect between the intention and the execution. The execution is precisely the way it was intended to be. However, with human beings, that's often not the case. Maybe more often than not, that's not the case. You set out with a set of intentions, you have a goal, you have a plan, but how often does the plan actually materialize? Someone said that there are two types of people who fail: those who don't have a plan and those who always stick to the plan. Things happen over the course of a plan that you have to change the plans. And the end result is usually not what you started out to do. In some way, it gets changed. They call that work orders during a construction site operation, right? You got to change things as you go along, as you make new discoveries. And that's true in everything in life. You can't just stick to the plan. It's not good to stick to the plan always. Sometimes you have to change it because there are things you see as you go along the process that you didn't realize in the beginning, because you're human. You can't see the outcome from the beginning. So we say in the L'chadodi Friday night, Sof Maaseh b'machshavat tchila. The end result was the original intention. Now with God, it's literally the original intention is the end result. But for us humans, the end result is usually not the original intention. And perhaps the original intention is that if new circumstances, new information, new challenges come along, I will alter my course to get to the best possible result as that I can get to. However, that doesn't mean you don't have to have a plan. A person should not say, well, the plans never really work out exactly as planned, so why bother making a plan? Well, that's foolish. You need to have a plan. Why? Because you need a vision. You need a goal. And you try to follow that vision and that goal and get to as close to that vision as possible. And that's why, from a human perspective, we begin with Shabbat. Shabbat is a vision of a good world, a perfect world, a world of peace, a world of harmony. With beginning our week with Shabbat, and that's why Shabbat, in a way, ends the week, but also begins the new week. It's the end of the previous week, but the beginning of the new week. Yes, it's the culmination, but it's also the springboard. It's also the beginning. And that's the idea of Shabbat being on both ends of the week. And from God's perspective, it's the end. He doesn't need a Shabbat before he begins, because whatever he plans will come to fruition. But for man, you need to begin with Shabbat. You need to begin with a sense of vision, of purpose. As we know that, every company, every organization has a mission statement. Why is it important to have a mission statement? Because if you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there. If you don't put an address into your GPS, don't expect to get there. You need to put a destination, a goal in mind. And it's interesting, someone once told me that Apple computers, let me see if I can look this up, if it pops up real fast, but what is the mission statement of Apple computers? Anyone know? Let me see if it says. I once heard that the mission statement of Apple computers is, here we go. I'm going to read it to you. It's not what I thought. It says the Apple's corporate mission is to bring the best personal computing products and support to students, educators, designers, scientists, engineers, business persons, and consumers in over 140 countries. But I heard that their vision, or maybe their mission statement, was to make the best products and leave the world a better place than we found it, which would be a much broader mission statement. In other words, you need every business, every organization needs a what, but it also needs a why. Why am I doing this? And so when I go into the week work, I start with Shabbat. My work may be in this field or that field, but what's the broader vision of why I'm doing this work? Ultimately, it's to bring this world to its perfection, to elevate the world, to bring peace, harmony, all the good symbolic visions of Shabbat into this world. So that is the idea of Shabbat as well in this week's Parsha, which ties into raise up the heads of the Jewish people. The word Rosh, when each letter is raised up, it spells out the word Shabbat. We now will go to the next section of this week's Torah portion, which is the Kior. The Kior was the wash basin, the copper laver that the Kohens would wash their hands and their feet when they came every day into the temple to serve, to do their religious duty. Today in synagogues, we wash our hands in the hallway, right? Most synagogues have a sink where you could wash your hand before you come in to pray. That's symbolic of like the Kohen who would wash his hands before he began his service in the temple. What's very interesting is that we're going to learn in the very next Torah portion that God instructed that these copper lavers, wash basins, should be made out of the copper of the women. The women's mirrors should be donated to make the laver. And the rabbis tell us that Moshe said, God, why would you use mirrors, which is an object of vanity, to build the wash basin for the Kohen to wash his hands when he goes to do the daily service? And Rashi said that Rashi quotes that these lavers were holy because when the men had no desire to be with their wives during the years of slavery and persecution in Egypt, the women would use the mirrors to beautify themselves, to arouse the desire and the lust of their husbands, so they would procreate with them and have children, because the women foresaw that unless we continue having children, there'll be no subsequent future Jewish generations. So therefore, they engage their husbands. And therefore, God says those mirrors are sacred, they're holy, and they should be the first vessel that the Kohen encounters when he comes into the temple every day. And the powerful lesson of that is that there is nothing in this world that God created that is outside of the realm of goodness and godliness. Everything can be elevated. You could look at a mirror like a object of vanity, or it could be a vessel to be utilized, an instrument to draw husbands and wives together through beauty and attraction and procreate and build the next generation of the Jewish people. And I think this is a very Jewish and powerful, healthy mindset that, today there are a lot of things people talk about: smartphones, social media. Is it good? Is it bad? And the answer is what you use it for. You could use, technology in a bad way. You could use it in a good way. It's your choice how you're going to use it. And that's true with money. It's true with everything in this world. We are the ones who decide whether something is good or bad. Things are usually not inherently good or bad. There are some things, obviously, that are off limits, so to speak, but most things are neutral and they could be utilized in either direction. And so this laver was made from the mirrors because these mirrors were used as a holy instrument. The next commandment in this week's Torah portion is how to make the Keturah, how to make the special incense that was used in the temple, and how to anoint all the vessels in the temple and special oils. And then it talks about the incense. And what's one of the interesting things about the incense is that one of the ingredients in the incense was something called chelbana. Now, chelbana, let me see how he translates it in English here. Galbanum. And our rabbis tell us that chelbana had actually a very foul odor. Rashi quotes this. And the question is, why would we insert in the incense spices a ingredient called chelbana, galbanum, that has a negative or a foul odor aroma to it? And Rashi says something so beautiful and so powerful, and I'm just going to quote it because it's so rich. Rashi says, God says, put the foul odor incense into the Keturah, into the incense. Use that ingredient that doesn't have a good aroma, doesn't have a good flavor. Why? Lilamdeinu, to teach us. Shelo yikal beinecha. You should never dismiss and reject. Litzaref imanu ba'agudas taneseinu tfilaseinu. When we come before God with prayer, as a community, with prayer, with fasting, beseeching, pleading, praying to God, never reject, dismiss at Poshe Yisrael, the rebellious, wayward Jews, sheyunimnim imanu, that they should be counted amongst us. You may say, well, this Jew, he's a bad Jew. I don't want him in the synagogue. I don't want him participating. He doesn't. We're coming to God for prayer. Why would we want this bad Jew? This Poshe Yisrael. Poshe Yisrael is a rebellious Jew, a Jew who rejects Judaism. And God says, put the galbanum, the chalbana in the spices, because part of the fragrance that is desirable before God includes every form of fragrance, even a Jew that doesn't have a good fragrance. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew, and every Jew has to be included. And this is right in from Rashi on this week's Torah portion, that in the temple, chalbana used to teach us this powerful internal lesson. Every Jew is a Jew, and even a Jew who you may think has a foul odor, so to speak, morally, spiritually, needs to be included in the community. It's interesting that the word tzibor, which is the Hebrew word for community, shliach tzibor, the emissary of the community, is made up of 4 letters: tzadik, beis, vav, resh, which is an acronym. Tzadikim, perfectly righteous; beinonim, intermediary people; virishaim, and wicked people. A community has perfectly righteous people, average people, and wicked people, but that's what makes up the community. And every Jew has to be included in the community. Every Jew has to be welcomed. To be honest with you, sometimes you hear about, stories in certain sections in Israel or wherever, where they shout names at Jews who drive on Shabbat, and they call them terrible things or throw rocks at them. And frankly, I don't understand it, because here we have a Rashi that says every Jew has to be welcomed and included and part of the community. We cannot reject any member of the community. And that's what Jewish law says. It's a little shocking, but if 9 Jews are looking for a minyan, and this is where we see Jewish law, it's not just in theory, it's in practice. 9 Jews are looking for a minyan, and in walks a 10th Jew. And this 10th Jew is maybe a terrible person. He may even be a criminal. He may even be worse than a criminal, God forbid. Does he count for the minyan? The answer is absolutely yes, because every Jew counts for a minyan. And not only that, you could have 9 of the most righteous Jews in the world, gather the 9 greatest leaders, rabbis, scholars amongst the Jewish people, and they don't form a minyan because they're short one. And then you could go into a maximum security prison and take 10 hardcore criminals and daven mincha with a minyan. And you say, what? 9 great rabbis? Even if you took the 9 greatest rabbis from all of Jewish history, Moshe, Aaron, King David, King Solomon, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, you put them all together, they wouldn't make a minyan if there are only 9. And 10 murderers and rapists make a minyan. It's a very shocking example, but the answer is very clear, that there's something that makes us Jewish that goes beyond our external behavior and actions. And therefore God says, use the chalbana, use that foul odored spice, to always remember that God wants that Jew in the mix. He wants him to attend. He wants him to be a part of the community. And in a sense, that enhances the prayers. It doesn't in any way diminish it. Not exactly a perfect story, but talking about Yom Kippur being the day of the second tablets being given, and forgiveness ties more into forgiveness, but also this idea that every Jew, it was a true story. Noah Heller tells the story that there was a fellow who came from the States to learn in Israel, became a Baal Teshuvah, became religious, and he had a very rough background. He was in gangs and all sorts of things, but he started learning Torah and getting connected to Judaism. And before Yom Kippur, they taught him in the yeshiva that everyone goes to the mikveh. And he went to the mikveh with all the men before Yom Kippur to immerse in the water. And when he got undressed, he was really embarrassed, because he had all these tattoos on his arms of women and lewd pictures and all these symbols from the gangs and all these religious Jews in the mikveh in Jerusalem with their white beards and their payas. And he tried to cover himself with the towel as much as possible, but he was really embarrassed. And an old man with a white beard came up to him and said, listen, I see you're embarrassed. We have nothing to be embarrassed about. He says, I also have a tattoo. And he's looking at him, you have a tattoo? He rolls up his sleeve and he shows him his number from the concentration camp. And he says, I've been through my hell, you've been through your hell, but tonight's Yom Kippur, we start all over again. And that's the idea of embracing every Jew, welcoming every Jew, understanding that every Jew, no matter what he looks like on his external facade, internally he has a neshama, a godly soul, and every Jew must be embraced and included in the community. Now we're still getting to the story of the golden calf, which is obviously the main story of this week's Torah portion, which requires a lot of discussion. But before that, we then have chapter 31. By the way, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the chat box. We're on Zoom, but I love to be interactive. So if I see a question or a comment, we'll address it. So chapter 31 discusses a man by the name of Bitzalel. Now, the word sail in Hebrew means shadow. El means God. Bitzalel means in the shadow of God. He was the artisan who was overseeing the construction of the Mishkan. He was like the chief, you could call him architect, builder, designer. He fashioned all the vessels, and Moses and Aaron served. Moses gave the instructions. Aaron was the high priest, but Bezalel implemented the vision of God to build a Mishkan. And today there's in Israel something called the Bezalel Institute for Artists, because he was the chief artisan. And just the name Bezalel means you're in the shadow of God. Our art is a divine inspiration to be able to see things from a perspective that is more lofty, more spiritual, not just the physical, tangible, but see the beauty in something and express it. And God says, I filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with knowledge, with every craft to weave designs, to work with gold, silver, copper, stone cutting for settings, and wood carvings to perform every craft. And then God gave him an assistant, a man by the name of Eliah ben Achisamach, and so on and so forth. And they were the ones who were going to design all of the articles. Now, here's something fascinating. We didn't even get to the golden calf, but we already have our first reference to the golden calf. You know, when you go to shul, you get called up. Yamod, your name and your father's name. They don't ask you who your grandfather was. They don't say Yaakov ben Moshe ben Zalman. They just say Yaakov ben Moshe. Here it says, who is Bezalel, the son of Uri? Who was Uri, his father? He was the son of his grandfather Hur. When the Torah goes back a third generation, there has to be a reason for it. So the question is, why do we tracing Bezalel's ancestry back not just one generation? Could have just said he's Bezalel, the son of Uri from the tribe of Judah. No, it says Bezalel, the son of Uri, who is the son of Hur. Why a third generation back? And here we have a fascinating answer given by the rabbis. The answer is that and Rashi quotes this, that who was Hur? Who was Hur? So we're going to find that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai to get the tablets, he went to get the Torah, and then he went back up to heaven to get the actual tablets. We all know the story that we're going to come to, that the Jewish people worshiped the golden calf. But before he went up, he appointed two people to take his place, to serve as the leaders in his absence. He knew he would be away for 40 days and 40 nights. So usually if there was a problem, there was a question, there was a leadership issue, Moshe would step in. But now Moses is going to be in heaven for 40 days and 40 nights. So he appointed Aaron, which was his brother, and Hur. But Hur was the nephew of Moshe. He was the son of Miriam. So his brother and his nephew, he said, Aaron and Hur, you guys be in charge. While I'm gone, you take control here. We actually found Hur's name once before when Moshe went up to the mountain to raise his hands to heaven in prayer as the Jews fought off Amalek a few weeks ago. Once again, it says Aaron and Hur held up the hand of Moses. So we find his name mentioned there. We find his name mentioned here at the golden calf. After that, we never hear his name again. And the question is, what happened to him? He was such an important player. He was at the holding up Moses' hands during the war against Amalek. He's the one who is in charge together with Aaron while Moshe goes up to get the Torah from heaven. So why does he disappear? And rabbis deduced this from a verse that when the Jews came to make the golden calf, Hur, the nephew, tried to stop them. We know the story. We're going to get to it soon in this week's Torah portion. The Jewish people see that Moshe Rabbeinu is delayed in his coming back. They think he's not coming back. They say Moses left us. He abandoned us. We're alone now. We're stranded in the desert. Let's make a new God to go before us. Now, we have to talk about what that means. How does a golden calf become a God? But we'll get to that soon. But the point is that the rabbis tell us, and it's the verse says that Aaron, when it came to the golden calf, it says that he not only allowed the Jews, he said, go get the jewelry from your wives and your children and your daughters and bring it to me and we'll make a golden calf. And it says, Vayiven Aaron Mizbeach. Aaron built a altar to bring sacrifices. And the question is, why is Aaron bringing sacrifices to this golden calf? So Rashi plays with the words and says, Vayiven mizavuach lefanav. Not he built an altar, but vayaven, he understood mizavuach, from the one that was slaughtered before his eyes. What does this mean? So Rashi says that when they came to make the golden calf, Chur tried to stop them, and the crowd was wild, and they literally lynched Chur and killed him right before the eyes of Aaron. When Aaron saw that this crowd is dangerous, they actually just killed his own nephew because he tried to stand in their way. He decided that in order not to get killed, he has to go along with this. So who was Chur? He was the one who gave his life to try to prevent the Jews from making the golden calf. So the next thing that happens is God says, okay, you made a golden calf. You used your gold and silver that I gave you when you left Egypt from the Egyptians to commit idolatry. Now you're going to repent and atone by using your gold and silver to build a tabernacle, a house of worship for me. So who was going to be the chief artisan? The grandson of the person who died defending the honor of God. He would be the one who would recreate the honor of God. And by linking B'tzal back 2 generations to Chur, the Torah is saying is that the sacrifice of Chur was not in vain. You may think, poor Chur, he died. He is a poor Chur that he died. But you may think his death was in vain because the Jews made a golden calf anyways. So his trying to prevent them didn't, it's one thing if you die for a cause, you accomplish something. You accomplished nothing. They went on and made the golden calf anyways. And the answer is, you did accomplish something because your grandson saw your sacrifice. And as a result of that, he was the one who was divinely inspired to build a house of God, to honor God, to carry on your defense of the honor of God. And this is a very powerful lesson that when we do things, there's what we do, but also the message we convey to our children, to our grandchildren, that our actions speak louder than words. And they are inspired by our deeds. And we can never fully appreciate or estimate the impact that we have and the result that it accumulates to. So that's the B'tzalel, why he was chosen to be the chief artisan. Then we have, of course, the laws of Shabbos. As we know, that as important as building the Mishkan was, they were not allowed to violate Shabbat, because Shabbat is the sign between God and the Jewish people. And as we know, there's holiness in time and holiness in space. Holiness in space is the tabernacle, the Mishkan, the synagogue. Holiness in time is Shabbat. And the holiness of Shabbat is greater and overrides the holiness of space. And therefore, in order even to build a house for God, surely your own construction has to stop on Shabbat. You're not allowed to work, you're not allowed to build. But you may think, well, I'm building a house for God. Maybe that's permissible. He says, no, it's more important to preserve the holiness in time, which is Shabbat, even more than the holiness in space, which would be the Mishkan. There's only one time you're allowed to violate Shabbat, of course, and that is to save a life, because the holiness of person is even greater, not only than the holiness of space, but even greater than the holiness of time, the holiness of the human being, of the neshama, and therefore you're allowed to violate Shabbat, of course, to save a life. So that is the introduction of Shabbat before we get into the Mishkan. But now we come to what you may call the blockbuster story of this week's Torah portion, which is a tragic story, because our rabbis used the analogy of a bride who has an affair 40 days after the wedding. She stood at the chuppah, and 40 days later, she commits infidelity against her husband. And here the God gave them the Torah at Mount Sinai, and one of the commandments, first one is, I am the Lord your God. The second one, you should not have any other gods, not to make any graven images or idols. And 40 days after they were wed to God at Mount Sinai, they actually make a graven image. And it's such a tragedy that our rabbis tell us, based on the verse, that means that anytime there's a sin and there is a consequence, a little bit of the sin of the golden calf is, so to speak, meted out in any future subsequent generation. It's a sin that's still, there's the gift that keeps on giving. God forbid, there's the sin that keeps on paying a price for it. So God did ultimately forgive the Jewish people through the pleading and the beseeching of Moshe Rabbeinu, but God said it's going to be a sin that's going to linger forever. And it's today people use the term golden calf as an analogy of worshiping something material, physical, turning physical objects into gods. So it's used more in the symbolic term, but this is literal that they made a golden calf. And I guess the first question is, what were they thinking? What is this idea of turning gold into a god? Do they really think that you could worship a god made out of gold? And what was the rationale? And it's very hard for our modern minds to understand this concept. Even idolatry doesn't really make sense to us. We know people worshiped all different types of idols in those days. Some religions today, I don't know much, but Buddhism, the sacred cow, things like that. So the modern mind doesn't understand why would you bow down to an object, to a statue. But look, the fact is, you could go to even churches and see, there are idols, there are statues. In Judaism, as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, we believe in radio, not in television. We hear the voice of God. We don't see the image of God, and we're not allowed to make any graven images because God is not corporeal, so therefore there's no physical image of God. However, it's like the story of this teacher. She tells, she sees a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old girl in her class drawing a picture. She said, what are you drawing? She said, I'm drawing God. Teacher said, but nobody knows what God looks like. And the kid looks up and the teacher says, well, you will in a minute. So we don't know what God looks like. But yet people have made images to feel a physical connection to something tangible that they could relate to, that they could see something that symbolizes God, so to speak. And also maybe through certain powers of divination, they felt they could channel God through this golden calf. That's a long subject of how that works. And look, even till today, I'm sure you've heard of the chamsa, right? Some people have a chamsa. It's a good luck charm. Why would this or the evil eye, or different things, or a red string, why would something physical be a source of blessing or protection? How is this red string going to protect you from something negative? So some people believe in these things, the chamsa, different things. Some people don't believe in it. But the idea is that it's a symbolism. It's not that it's physically going to protect you, but it's invoking something from a spiritual realm that spiritually somehow is going to channel something positive to you. So, look, idolatry is something that we are not tempted with by and large today, but back in the day, you just read Tanakh and you see idolatry was a big temptation. It was the rage of the time, worshiping idols and other gods and foreign gods. That's why God had to give that commandment not to worship idols. So the Jews go ahead and they make this golden calf. And what does Moshe Rabbeinu do? When he comes down from the mountain, he takes the tablets and he throws them to the ground and he smashes them. Now, there's a number of things we need to talk about. The first thing is we have 2 leaders, Aaron and Moses. Aaron is a peacemaker. We know it says, be like the disciples of Aaron, love peace, pursue peace. He wants to keep peace. When the Jews come and they're clamoring, we want to make a god because Moses is not coming back, they go into the state of defeat. They feel depressed. They feel dejected. They feel abandoned. They're feeling a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. They revert to their old mentality as slaves, and they need to make a golden calf. And Aaron sees what happened to Hur, and he says, I got to keep the peace. I got to stall. I got to delay till Moses comes back down. And he goes along with their plan. He tries to delay. He says, go get the jewelry of your wives and your daughters and your sons and bring it to me, figuring he'll buy some time. They rip it off their wives and daughters, and no time is saved. And by the time Moses comes down, they're worshiping a golden calf. That's how Aaron deals with it. And then you have Moses. Moses comes down. He sees them worshiping a golden calf. He takes the tablets. He throws it on the ground. He smashes the tablets. Then he takes the golden calf. He grinds it down to dust. And then he tells the Levites to go pick up their swords, and they kill 3,000 people in that day. And ultimately, he prays to God for forgiveness, and God forgives the Jewish people. And Moshe Rabbeinu prays very hard and actually tells God, wipe me out of your book if you don't forgive the Jewish people. But just for a moment to focus on these two forms of leadership, because I think we could all relate to it. When there's a crisis, when there's a situation that's out of hand, there's the Aaron way of dealing with it and the Moses way of dealing with it. The Aaron way is, let's keep the peace. Let's not upset people. Let's just, sort of dance between the raindrops till we figure out what to do. And then there's the Moses way, which is smash the tablets, raise hell, grind that golden calf into dust. One is more of and I think in parenting too, one is, in a more peace-loving way, just trying to do everything to keep the peace. But that doesn't always work, as you know. And then there's the way of doing it with force. But that could be too strong sometimes. And sometimes we don't know. Should we take this approach or that approach to resolve a situation? Should we come at it with force and reject it out of hand and, destroy it, so to speak? Or should we sort of manipulate and maneuver till we get it to where we want it to go? And there's no one right answer. Maybe there's a time for this and there's a time for that. But what you see from Moses and Aaron is that it's a combined leadership, that it's both tactics together. Moses was a man of truth. He had zero tolerance for this. And he wasn't going to, bend anything or compromise anything. He said it as it is. He took the tablets, he smashed them. He had to shock the Jews. He had to make them realize how serious the situation is. He had to, and it's interesting, Moses was punished that he didn't go into the land of Israel because he struck a rock out of anger, according to Maimonides. He lost his temper and he struck the rock. Here, he smashes the tablets out of anger. And yet, he's never punished for smashing the tablets. Not only that, the last words of the Torah is Asher Shibarta, that he broke the tablets. The last two words is that he broke the tablets before the eyes of Israel, which Rashi says Asher Shibarta is from the word Yasher Koach. God said to him, you did a great job. Why? Because in Jewish law it says a parent is allowed to act angry to discipline a child as long as they don't feel angry. Moses wasn't angry. He was doing this as a display of anger to shock the Jews, to jolt them, to make them realize the severity and the gravity of what they've done, and to get them to do teshuvah, because the only way he could besiege God is if the Jews would do teshuvah for what they did. And it's interesting, every fast day, we read this section of the golden calf, how Moshe besieged God for forgiveness. So this idea of having the balance between the Moses and Aaron approaches of dealing with situations, and knowing how to subdue a rebellion, as in the case of the Jewish people who were rising up to make a golden calf, you find these, and it's interesting, Moses was the man of truth. Moshe Emet, Moses is truth, his Torah is truth. Aaron was the man of peace. It says, be like the disciples of Aaron. But when Moses died, the Jews mourned for him for 30 days. But when Aaron died, it says all of the house of Israel, meaning there was more mourning and grieving and crying and sadness when Aaron died, because he was more beloved by the people, because his methodology was one of peace. And we're even taught that you could be like Aaron, that you could sometimes compromise the truth, tell a white lie in order to make peace, because the most important thing is to make peace amongst people. One of the interesting points that the rabbis point out is that when Moses pleads for forgiveness for the Jewish people, he says, forgive the Jewish people because they are stiff-necked people. Now the question is, why would Moses bring up the fact that they're stiff-necked? The fact that they're stiff-necked is something negative. But perhaps what Moses was saying to God was, yes, they're stiff-necked, as is evident from the fact that they made a golden calf 40 days after Mount Sinai. But that stiff-neckedness, that tenacity, that resilience, that stubbornness can actually work out in your advantage, God. Because this same stiff-necked people that made a golden calf is also the same stiff-necked people that will not bow to any outside pressure, that will never succumb to the influences of the world, that will keep their heads high, like someone who's stiff-necked, they can't bow their head, like Mordechai the Jew in the Purim wouldn't bow his head. He's stiff-necked. He's going to hold his head high. He's going to be a proud Jew. He's not going to let all the anti-Semitism and persecution and oppression bend him and his will and his devotion to God. So Moses says, listen, it's like a life-threatening illness, and you give a life-saving medicine. The life-saving medicine, like chemotherapy, could have a lot of negative side effects, but you still take it. Why? Because the good outweighs the bad. Being a stiff-necked people is not a virtue. Jews are known to be sometimes stiff-necked or chutzpah, whatever it may be. But that's a negative side effect. The actual stiff-neckedness is what has saved us as a people, that we refuse to give in. And God is convinced by Moshe's argument that in the long run, this character trait is going to serve the Jewish people and serve their relationship with God very well. I mentioned that Yom Kippur is the day that we were given the second set of tablets, which signaled God's forgiveness for the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf. And it's interesting, however, every fast day we read this section, and it's found in this week's Torah portion. Every fast day when we're asking for forgiveness for God, we read this section, because this section is where God, after the sin of the golden calf, after the forgiveness is granted, Moshe Rabbeinu says, God, show me your face. And God says, no human being could see my face. You could see my back, but you can't see my face, meaning we can't understand the ways of God. But God says, well, you can't see my face. I will give you a formula that you could connect with me and always utilize for compassion and forgiveness. And that is known as the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim, the 13 attributes of divine mercy. And we sing it often on the prayers in Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hashem, Kel Racham V'Chanon, Nerech, Apayim, Rav Chesed, V'Yemes. It's the 13 attributes of divine mercy that God taught Moses to beseech him on all occasions. And we say it especially in the 10 days of repentance and in the Slichot. But then, when we talk about Moshe Rabbeinu pleading for forgiveness, it says like this: Vayechal Moshe et Pnei Hashem Elakav. Moshe Rabbeinu beseeches or pleads before God, and he says to God, please forgive the Jewish people for this grave sin that they have committed. And ultimately, Moshe Rabbeinu, the Jewish people are forgiven. Now, we all know that Yom Kippur begins every year with Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre is nullification of vows, where we ask for nullification of our vows. And there's a lot of discussions. Why do we begin Yom Kippur with nullification of vows? Why this very moving service? Kol Nidre, V'Yasarei. There are many answers. One powerful answer given is that the Jews during the time of the Spanish Inquisition composed this because they publicly had to take a vow to the church that they would be converse to Christianity. But now they said, God, we ask for forgiveness. We nullify those vows. They were done through coercion. But the word Vayechal, which if you're looking in your book, it's in the Chumash, it's chapter 32, verse 11. Vayechal Moshe means Moses pleaded before God. But the word Vayechal could also from the word, when you it says the words of your mouth should be sacred. So when you make a vow, the words are sacred. But Vayechal means to make, to undo the vow. And there's a very powerful midrash that says that God said to Moses, I can't forgive the Jewish people because I already took a vow. In the 10 Commandments, I said that if anyone worships other gods, the punishment is death. So how am I supposed to forgive the Jewish people? And God says, I will absolve you. Moses says to God, I will absolve you of your vow. And Moses absolves the vow. Vayechal Moshe absolves the vow of God to destroy the Jewish people after the sin of the golden calf. And it's interesting that, there were times where God did not allow the beseeching of others to change his plan, like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though Abraham pleaded, he was not effective, meaning he could not persuade God to forgive the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God wiped them out. Same thing, the generation of the flood, Tower of Babel. In this case, God relents. And that's what it says. God relents on his plan, and he forgives the Jewish people. And, this is a very practical lesson in life, that sometimes winning is losing, and sometimes losing is winning. What does that mean? Sometimes you're the victor. You won. You conquered the other person. Like God, so to speak, destroys the certain generations. But what's left? In a sense, he loses because all of his creation was destroyed. But sometimes you relent, you give in, you forgive, you lose, so to speak. But you really win, you really gain by that. And that's a very important lesson in life, that, winning sometimes isn't only everything. Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes you won, but what did you win? It's a hollow victory because you won, but as a result of the winning, you destroyed the relationship, you destroyed the other person. So what was so good about winning? You in certain circumstances, winning, like a husband and wife, for example, you don't want to win. Sometimes by asking for forgiveness and acknowledging the wrong and saying you're sorry, and you say, I lost, so to speak. I'm sorry, I was wrong. That's the way you win. You win the relationship. And the same thing with God and the Jewish people. And that's part of Moshe Rabbeinu's persuasive argument with Hashem, why he should forgive the Jewish people, because you don't want to lose this relationship with the Jewish people. And there's a lot of interesting midrashim how Moshe Rabbeinu defended the Jews. One way is he said to God, you're the one who told them to take gold and silver from their Egyptian neighbors. What did you think they were going to do with it? And the analogy in the Medrash is, if you give your child a lot of wealth and self-indulgence, and then they become corrupt, well, whose fault is it, the kid or the parent? The kid gave this child, who was not mature enough and not responsible enough, so much material, indulgence, that he went wayward. He became corrupt as a result. So the parents should not have given them all of that. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu says to Hashem. And obviously, remember where they're coming from. They're coming from Egypt. They're coming from an idolatrous society where they lived for hundreds of years. And therefore, you have to understand where they're coming from and forgive their doing. They had this relapse, and please forgive the Jewish people. And ultimately, that is what Hashem does. He forgives the Jewish people. And then he instructs Moshe Rabbeinu to carve out a second set of tablets. And here there's one extra word, psalacha, carve out for yourself 2 tablets of stone. And our Rabbi say that God was saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, the first tablets I carved out, and therefore you were quick to smash them because you didn't invest any effort. This time I'll let you carve it out. And if you invest effort, then you'll be more hesitant to smash them. And therefore, I'll have you make the tablets rather than me making it on your behalf. The end of the Torah portion turns our attention to the major festivals, Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. But before we get to that, the prohibition against intermarriage is derived from this week's Torah portion. And we all know that in Judaism, we follow matrilineal descent. If the mother's Jewish, then the children are Jewish. If the father's Jewish, the children are not Jewish. And a lot of reasons for this. Practically, the mother carries the child and has the greatest impact on the development of the child physically and spiritually as well. But this is actually derived from a verse in this week's Torah portion where it says, when you come to the land of Israel, the Canaanites will have their gods. There, don't go astray after their gods. Why? Because if they will take your sons for your daughter, if they will take your sons for their daughters, your sons will go after their gods. Meaning, if a Jewish man marries one of the idolatrous women from the other nations, they will lead your son astray. And therefore, your children, your grandchildren from that woman will not be Jewish. And since the Torah only does it one-sided, that the women of the other nations will lead your son astray, meaning that no longer will those children from your son be Jewish, but in the reverse, not. So what the Torah seems to be implying is that the woman has the greater impact on the husband, on the children, on the family, and therefore it's determined by the mother, and therefore biologically as well. it is determined by the mother whether the children are Jewish or not. But this happens to be the biblical source for this idea that it's dependent on the mother. And I see Alan tells us here that, yes, skin in the game, Moshe Rabbeinu has to carve the second tablets in order to have, so to speak, skin in the game, that he's invested in it 100%. And another idea to take that skin in the game idea a little bit further is that if you notice, the first commandments were not given the way we have Torah scrolls today, where it's written with ink on parchment, but they're carved out into the stones. And the simple answer is that it takes a lot more effort to chisel out letters on a stone than to just write it with ink on parchment. And what the Torah is teaching us with that very first image of engraved letters is that it's not enough to just write the Torah. You have to engrave it upon yourself. It's easy to learn to speak the words of the Torah, to engage in them. Relatively, it's easy compared to actually making sure it permeates you, it touches you, it becomes a part of you. Just like when you engrave letters on a stone, they become a part of the stone. You can't even distinguish between the letter and the stone or the letters of the stone. It's one entity. The ultimate goal of Torah is that we shouldn't just pay lip service to the Torah, but we should actually follow it and practice it and incorporate it into our lives. And so much so that it should become our very essence, our very identity, our very character, our very nature, like those engraved letters. Is it more difficult? Yes, but it's also much more permanent. So when you work on changing your habits, yes, they're very challenging in the beginning, but once you change it, it becomes enduring and permanent. And as we know, once you form a habit, it almost becomes second nature, becomes easy. So a lot of times we pay lip service to a lot of values and ideas. Oh, this is righteous, this is good, this is bad. And it's sort of like ink on parchment. With time, the ink could fade away. We may be inspired for a day, for a week, but it doesn't last. The hard work is to engrave it on yourself. But when you do that, in the long run, it's a lot easier because it becomes your very nature, your very fabric. And we all could do that. Whatever value, whatever virtue, whatever mitzvah, whatever concept you're learning about, sort of ask yourself, okay, how do I make this a part of who I am? How do I ingrain it within my very being? And that takes much more effort, but in the long run, it becomes who you are. And the result is so much greater. So that is the idea of you carving it out. You know, there's certain things others can do for you, like God can carve the stones for you, but it's not as permanent and meaningful. Same thing, I think, applies with children. We could do certain things for our kids, but it's much better when they choose to do it on their own, when they put in the effort to do it on their own. So there are really no shortcuts. It has to be done through hard work and effort, and then it is it's much more meaningful. Last comment I see here: could that be the spiritual meaning of Passover, the actual doing and the cleaning out old habits? Yes. So definitely, one of the ideas of Passover is not just to clean out the chametz, but to clean out the arrogance, because chametz is haughtiness, represents inflation, and flour and water could be matzah flat or it could be risen and puffed up. And the idea is to rid ourselves of that arrogance and haughtiness and pride, which is the negative ego, which is the source of all the sins. And so yes, it's the real cleaning is hard, but it's not as hard as the internal cleaning that has to be done. And now we are 30 days before Pesach, so it's a great time to start focusing on that as well. So I wish everyone a wonderful, wonderful day and a good week ahead. And we look forward to seeing everyone Shabbat. And thank you all for participating in today's class. Have a wonderful day.